They knew. On August 8, 1942, a worried man appeared at the American consulate in Geneva, Gerhard Riegner, the representative of the World Jewish Congress in Switzerland. He had come to dictate a telegram to U.S. Vice Consul Howard Elting, Jr. The telegram's contents were horrifying. Hitler's headquarters was discussing a plan to exterminate all Jews in the occupied territories, between 3.5 and 4 million people, in one blow, in order to resolve the Jewish question in Europe once and for all. Riegner was unaware that the mass murder had already been underway for over a year. He thought the plan would be implemented in the fall. He believed the Nazis were considering using hydrocyanic acid, what would later become known as Zyklon B. The details were imprecise, but the essence was absolutely correct. The Third Reich had begun the systematic extermination of European Jewry. Elting forwarded the message to the American legation in Bern, adding that Riegner's information may well contain some truth. Minister Leland Harrison, the senior U.S. diplomat in Switzerland, disbelieved Riegner, writing that the massacre plan was likely a war rumor fueled by fear. Nevertheless, he forwarded the message to the State Department in Washington. State Department officials in Washington agreed with Secretary Harrison, believing Riegner's news could not be true. They decided not to forward Riegner's message to its intended recipient, Rabbi Stephen Wise, president of the World Jewish Congress and its American affiliate, the American Jewish Congress. At the same time, Gerhard Riegner visited the British consulate in Geneva. He dictated a similar message to diplomatic officials there, who forwarded it to London. The World Jewish Congress representative in England, Samuel Sidney Silverman, was a member of Parliament. Although Foreign Office officials debated whether to forward the message to Silverman, as it could have unpleasant consequences if the public learned of the news, they ultimately decided to do so. Riegner asked Silverman to consult with New York. Silverman therefore sent a copy of Riegner's message directly to Rabbi Wise, which arrived on Saturday, August 29th, 3 weeks after Riegner met with Elting in Geneva. It was the Riegner telegram, the first documented message about the final solution to reach the West. The source of the information was Eduard Schulte, a German industrialist with close ties to the highest echelons of the Nazi regime. His identity was not revealed until decades after the war. Schulte risked his life to transmit this information. But Washington and London did not believe it. 3 weeks of delay, months of doubt. Meanwhile, thousands of people were being murdered every day in Poland's death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. Operation Reinhard, the systematic extermination of Polish Jews, was in full swing. By the end of 1942, approximately 1.5 million people would be killed. In the spring of 1942, as historian Waitman Wade Bjorn notes, 75–80% of Holocaust victims were still alive, and 20–25% had been killed. 11 months later, these percentages had reversed. 1942 became a true annus horribilis in world history, the year when most of the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust were murdered. And the Allies knew. Not everything, not all the details, but they knew. They received reports, they intercepted radio messages, they read eyewitness accounts. In the summer and fall of 1942, a flood of information about the mass murder of Jews in Eastern Europe reached diplomatic channels in Great Britain and the United States from a variety of sources: the Polish government in exile, Jewish organizations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, even the Vatican. By early November 1942, the Americans had received confirmation of the information received from Jewish sources in August. In early December 1942, the United Nations, or the Allied Nations, issued their famous declaration acknowledging the fact that the Germans were murdering the Jewish people in Europe. On December 17, 1942, a declaration signed by 11 Allied nations, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Norway, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, and Yugoslavia, as well as the French National Committee, was issued. In the strongest possible language, It condemned the Nazi dictatorship for its brutal policy of cold-blooded extermination. But what did they do with this knowledge? Nothing. Not a single word in the declaration addressed the possibility of salvation. Not a single specific action. Only a promise of future retribution. As historian Jason Dawsey writes, acknowledging these facts was no small act, but it was a promise that could not be fulfilled anytime soon after 1942. While millions of people died in the camps, the world chose to remain silent, not out of ignorance, but out of inaction, out of political calculations, out of fear, out of indifference. This is the story of how the greatest evil of the 20th century continued, not because it was ignorant, but because those who knew decided to do nothing. By mid-1942, the Nazi extermination machine had reached its peak efficiency. By this time, an important stage in the history of the Holocaust had already been reached. From the relatively unorganized killings by mobile Einsatzgruppen units on the Eastern Front in the summer of 1941 to systematic extermination in purpose-built death camps in occupied Poland. Beginning in late 1941, the Germans began constructing specialized extermination centers designed exclusively for gas chambers. These were not labor camps, nor concentration camps in the traditional sense, but industrial death facilities. In 1942, Operation Reinhard, the code name for the extermination program against Polish Jews, unfolded in all its horrific fullness. 5 major death camps were built or expanded. Belzec, opened in March 1942, Sobibor, May 1942, Treblinka, July 1942, as well as the previously existing Chelmno since December 1941, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was expanded in 1942. Each of these camps was optimized for killing. Belzec, for example, could process, that is kill, about 15,000 people per day at full capacity. Sobibor, about 20,000. Treblinka, about 25,000. The combined capacity of all 5 camps was about 100,000 people per day, although they generally operated below full capacity most of the time, killing an average of 5,000 to 8,000 people per day. Throughout 1942, approximately 1.5 million people were killed, most of them Polish Jews. The logistics of extermination were complex and well-oiled. Jews were transported by train from ghettos and other parts of Europe, often in sealed carriages, without water or air, in conditions that were already deadly. The death roads, as they would later be called, crisscrossed occupied Europe, heading for Poland. Historians estimate that between 25% and 50% of deportees died en route before ever reaching the gas chambers. Those who survived to arrive faced a choice: immediate death in the gas chambers or temporary work, leading to death from starvation, disease, or execution within a week, a month, or several months. What's important for the story of the Allied silence is that in 1942, this activity was no secret. The Nazis didn't hide their fundamental goal. They spoke openly of solving the Jewish question, though the details remained classified at the lowest levels. German documents and photographs preserved in archives after the war clearly show that the Nazis created written reports, orders, mortality reports, equipment requests. All of this was documented. Moreover, the Nazis sent ordinary commercial radiograms, often in clear text, about the situation in various camps. They made no secret of the fact that people were being held in the camps and processed. British intelligence, which intercepted and deciphered German radio transmissions via the famous Enigma machine, something the Americans themselves, by the way, were unaware of until the end of the war, knew the death rate in these camps. In England and the United States, although they lacked direct access to intercepted Enigma messages, the information was securely classified even from the Allies, there were other ways to obtain information. The Polish government in exile, based in London, had a well-developed network of contacts in the occupied territory. Information about the death camps reached London through clandestine channels. These camps were located in Poland, and the Poles naturally knew about their existence and purposes better than anyone else. In early 1942, the Polish government in exile sent its first reports on the extermination of Jews to the British and American governments. One of the most important was prepared by Witold Rilke, a member of the Polish underground, whose pseudonym was Jacek. In his report, known as the Raczyński Report, after the man who submitted it, he described conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto and the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Although this particular report focused on the ghettos rather than the death camps, it contained enough information to show the Allies the scale of what was happening. By the summer of 1942, reports were arriving in London that the Nazis were building special camps to exterminate Jews. The British Foreign Office received the reports, but, as historians have noted, officials were confused and doubted their accuracy. The idea that all of modern European industry was being directed toward the production of death seemed too horrific to be true. This was a psychological reaction known as denial. The human mind simply refused to process information of such horrific magnitude. But the information kept coming. By the summer of 1942, enough data had accumulated in British and American communications channels to allow government officials to realize that something was happening outside the normal range of wartime. The scale was enormous. The methods were unprecedented. The goal was clearly genocidal. And yet, despite the available information, the top leadership of both countries chose to adhere to the grand strategy of the war: defeat Hitler first and deal with the crimes later. As historian David Vines wrote, "The problem for the Americans and the British was that they did not see casualties as a priority." In the summer of 1942, the flow of information about the mass murder of Jews reached a critical level. Sources were diverse, from the Polish underground to Jewish organizations, from international NGOs to informants within the Nazi regime itself. All this accumulated in the archives of London and Washington, gradually painting a picture that was impossible to ignore, although ignoring it was precisely this ignorance that became the government's response. One of the most significant documents obtained by the Allies in the summer of 1942 was the report that became known as the Raczyński Report, or the Cormiak Report, after the names of those who helped distribute it. It was prepared based on information gathered by the Polish underground and contained a detailed description of the systematic extermination of Jews. Although the Polish underground did not have complete information about the death camps, many details were learned later, the report contained enough information to demonstrate that mass murder was taking place. On June 23, 1942, the Polish government in exile sent an official note to the British government and the governments of other allies, outlining the facts of the systematic extermination of Jews. This was the first official document of this level, containing a direct statement of genocide. The note was received by the Foreign Office and forwarded to the appropriate officials. The British authorities' reaction was suspicious. Why, they wondered, was the Polish government in exile spreading such horrific information? Was it propaganda? Was it an exaggeration to attract attention? The Foreign Office decided to verify the information through other sources before taking it seriously. As historians would later write, it was a classic example of how those unwilling to believe the horrific find reasons to doubt. In parallel, on August 19, 1942, the Swiss newspaper Basel National Zeitung published an article about the Nazis murdering Jews in Eastern Europe. This article was picked up by American intelligence, and the Associated Press passed the information on to the United States. On August 30, 1942, the New York Times published a short article on page 7, titled "Poles Told to Flee or Die," which briefly mentioned the Nazi plan to kill all the Jews in Europe. The article was placed at the bottom of the page, next to the classified ads. It was Regner's telegram, which was making its way through diplomatic channels. On August 8th, Gerhard Regner, the representative of the World Jewish Congress in Geneva, met with American consul Howard Elting Jr. and conveyed information about the Nazi plan to exterminate all the Jews of Europe. Elting passed the information on to the American legation in Bern, where Minister Leland Harrison, as mentioned above, dismissed it as rumors fueled by fear. Secretary Harrison was a seasoned diplomat, but he chose not to believe what he heard. Instead of immediately passing Regner's information to the State Department, he decided to conduct an independent investigation. This meant delay. Precious weeks were lost, while thousands of people were being killed daily in the death camps. Finally, on September 1st, 1942, when Regner's telegram reached the State Department, officials there made a decision that would have tragic consequences. They decided to delay the transmission of the information to Rabbi Stephen Wise, president of the American Jewish Congress. The official reason, as the State Department reported, was that the information could not be confirmed. It was a lie. The information could have been verified, but the State Department chose not to verify it. Instead, officials, including Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, discussed what might happen if this information became known to the American public. They feared panic, anti-Semitism, and demands to save Jews rather than win the war. In other words, they feared that the American people might demand that their government act on behalf of Holocaust victims. In Britain, the process was slightly different, but the result was the same. Regner's telegram, transmitted through the British consulate in Geneva, reached the Foreign Office. There, it was received by Victor Cabot, the man who would later write that the telegram was too terrible to be true. British officials also decided that the information could not be published without verification, although they took no concrete steps to do so. In November 1942, 3 months after receiving Regner's telegram, American officials finally relayed the information to Rabbi Wise. But by this time, the information was old news. A flood of other, often contradictory, reports had flooded diplomatic channels, and its initial impact had been lost. On November 29, 1942, the State Department issued a brief press release, which was carried by the American press. The State Department has received confirmation of reports from Jewish organizations that the Germans are murdering Jews in Europe in accordance with the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jewish people, the release stated. However, the same press release also stated that there are insufficient specific facts to support this, effectively denying the information they had just provided. Just over a week later, on December 17, 1942, the Allied nations issued a joint declaration acknowledging the extermination of the Jews. However, as already noted, this declaration contained no specific actions or offers of assistance. It was a declaration of intent, an empty gesture. As historian Mark Wines would later write, the UN was notified of the genocide, but did nothing to stop it. The first warnings were given, information was transmitted, but the Allies chose silence and inaction. By the end of 1942, Britain had accumulated enough information about the Holocaust to understand the scale of what was happening. This information came from several sources. The Polish government in exile, which had an extensive intelligence network in the occupied territory, intercepted German radio messages, which British intelligence successfully deciphered using the Enigma machine. Reports from British intelligence officers based in neutral countries. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which had access to some camps, and Jewish organizations receiving information from refugees and underground networks. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was one of the few political leaders of the time to speak out about Nazi crimes. On October 24, 1942, Churchill addressed the House of Commons, the lower house of the British Parliament, and said, "The Germans are committing unspeakable atrocities against the peoples they rule. We are well aware of them, and in particular of the vicious pogroms against the Jews." However, although Churchill openly acknowledged the crimes, he did not propose any specific actions to prevent them. The Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, was led by Anthony Eden, known for his caution and reluctance to act without a thorough analysis of the situation. When Foreign Office officials began receiving reports of death camps, their reaction was skeptical. Robert Miles, a senior Foreign Office official with access to intercepted German correspondence, recommended against publishing information about mass murder, arguing that it was too horrific to be true and could cause panic among the population. It was a classic expression of British restraint at the time. As historian Martin Gilbert, who had access to Foreign Office archives, would later write, British officials seemed to believe that if they didn't say something publicly, it wasn't happening. Silence was an instrument of denial. When the UN Joint Declaration on the Genocide of the Jews was issued on December 17, 1942, it was more due to US pressure than British initiative. Even Churchill, who would later be known for his firm stance against the Nazis, explained his position in his memo of December 20, 1942, as follows. I see the folly of wasting resources on saving Jews because the primary objective of the war is defeating Hitler. Saving Jews must be a secondary objective, subordinated to the main strategy of the war. This memo from Churchill reveals the essence of the British position. The Holocaust was acknowledged, but not treated as a priority. Resources, time, and attention, everything had to be focused on winning the war. Saving victims was seen as a distraction from the primary objective. This logic, while understandable from a military strategy perspective, had horrific consequences. Every month spent inactive meant the deaths of hundreds of thousands more people. In early 1943, Britain received an offer from the Nazis that presented it with a moral dilemma. Through the Romanian government, the Nazis offered to allow approximately 70,000 Romanian Jews to emigrate to safety in exchange for money or basic necessities. It was a horrific trade in human lives, but it offered a real opportunity to save real lives. However, the Foreign Office recommended rejecting the offer, arguing that it could set a dangerous precedent that we should pay for the liberation of people from Nazi control. Moreover, the Foreign Office expressed concern that if such a large number of Jews came to Britain or the territories under its control, it would fuel anti-Semitism in British society. As one Foreign Office official wrote, the acceptance of 70,000 Romanian Jews could cause serious problems with public opinion. In other words, the rescue of these people was rejected out of fear of an anti-Semitic reaction. This was self-denial. By the end of 1943, Britain had acquired more detailed information about the death camps, including information about the largest of them, Auschwitz. The Polish underground, which had contacts within the camp, provided detailed information about the methods of killing, the number of victims, and the geographic location. British intelligence passed this information on to the Ministry of Defense, where it was distributed to military strategists. A proposal emerged. Why not bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz to make deportations more difficult? Why not bomb the gas chambers themselves? The Defense Ministry's response was firm. Such bombing would divert resources from the primary objective, winning the war. Furthermore, such bombing could kill Jewish prisoners used as labor in the camp, and would lead to accusations that we are killing the very people we are trying to save. It was an oft-repeated argument. Saving some immediately meant risking the death of others. But this argument was cynical and unfair. First, most people arriving at Auschwitz were killed in the gas chambers within hours of their arrival. Second, even if some prisoners were killed in the bombing, they were still doomed to die in the gas chambers within days or weeks. Saving lives by bombing the killing infrastructure was a moral imperative. However, Britain took no action. The Holocaust continued, and England, with the information and military capabilities, chose silence and inaction. As historian David Lipsky would later write, Britain knew what was coming. It had the power to stop it, but it decided that other goals were more important. The United States, although it entered the war later than Britain, also possessed information about the Holocaust. American intelligence, while lacking access to Enigma intercepts, the British kept this information strictly secret, obtained information through other channels, from refugees passing through neutral countries, from American consuls in neutral countries such as Switzerland and Sweden, from Jewish organizations and their networks, and from informants within the Nazi regime, such as Eduard Schulte, a German industrialist who risked his life to transmit information about the final solution. The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which would later become the CIA, was a new organization founded in 1942 to collect and analyze intelligence. Its director, William Wild Bill Donovan, was a man eager for aggressive intelligence, but even he could not overcome the political obstacles surrounding the Holocaust. The OSS provided the State Department and the White House with several reports on the mass murder of Jews in Eastern Europe. But these reports were met with the same skepticism and distrust that characterized information received from other sources. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was aware of the Holocaust. He received reports from his advisors, including Henry Morgenthau Jr., who was in charge of finance, and Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, who received information from Jewish organizations. However, Roosevelt, like Churchill, viewed winning the war as the top priority. As he stated in one of his memos, "We must concentrate on victory. After victory, Nazism will be punished and the crimes will be investigated. But now our task is to win the war." This was the reasonable inaction argument, repeated again and again by American leaders. However, this argument was disingenuous. America was not in a difficult position where it had to choose between saving victims and winning the war. It was capable of doing both. But doing so required attention, resources, and political will, which Roosevelt was unwilling to provide. In 1943, a bureaucratic revolution of sorts took place in the State Department. A young lawyer named Breckinridge Long, who wielded significant influence over U.S. immigration policy, actively worked to tighten immigration laws and reduce quotas for Jewish refugees. Long made no secret of his anti-Jewish views, and his policies effectively closed America to Jews seeking refuge from the Nazis. As historian David Weitz would later write, Long wasn't just a bureaucrat following policy. He was an active proponent of a policy that saved Nazis by denying asylum to determined Jews. U.S. immigration policy was one of the main obstacles to saving Jews. Although the official immigration quota for Jews was approximately 150,000 per year, the State Department continually found reasons to deny visas. Certificates, documents, and guarantees of financial support were required. All of these were obstacles that were impossible for people fleeing occupied Europe. Over time, as the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust grew, the number of rescued Jews who managed to reach America remained minimal. By the end of the war, America had saved less than 5% of the total number of Jews rescued. In 1943, the Bermuda Conference was convened, at which Britain and the United States discussed the possibility of creating a refugee shelter. The conference took place in April, while the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was raging, and people were literally dying of hunger and disease in dozens of camps across Europe. But the conference led nowhere. Both sides agreed that special shelters for Jews should not be created, as this would lead to discrimination against other categories of refugees. The logic was perverse. To avoid discrimination against others, one must not help Jews. The conference ended without any decisions. By 1944, the situation had worsened. Henry Morgenthau Jr., who was in charge of finance and had access to intelligence, began to realize that the State Department was deliberately concealing information about the Holocaust. He demanded a meeting with Roosevelt and brought with him the Black Book, a report containing evidence that the State Department knew about the Holocaust and deliberately did nothing about it. As Morgenthau would later write in his memoirs, "When I showed Roosevelt these documents, I could see that the president was shocked. But the shock quickly wore off, and he returned to his standard position, victory first." However, the pressure continued to mount. As a result of public pressure and Morgenthau's advocacy, Roosevelt finally signed an executive order in January 1944 establishing the War Refugee Board, an organization designed to rescue victims of Nazi persecution. But even this step was insignificant. The board received minimal funding, a limited mandate, and faced constant resistance from the State Department. In 1944, another event occurred that demonstrated the extent to which the American leadership was willing to go to maintain a political line. When Auschwitz could no longer be hidden, when its existence became widely known thanks to the escape of Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler, Jewish organizations asked the American government to bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz, or even the camp itself. But the Army Air Forces refused, claiming it would be too much of a diversion of resources. Meanwhile, American bombers were bombing the Auschwitz III, Monowitz chemical plants, located less than 10 kilometers from the gas chambers, but they were never ordered to bomb the death camp itself. It was a historical irony and tragedy. American aircraft had the ability to bomb the death camp. Fully aware of its existence and purpose, they had precise coordinates. But a political choice was made to allow Auschwitz to continue its deadly work. As historian Irving Abelman later wrote, it was a choice. Not a difficult necessity, not an uncertainty, simply a choice. Pope Pius X, Eugenio Pacelli, remains one of the most controversial figures in the history of the Catholic Church in the 20th century, particularly in the context of his stance on the Holocaust. In the decades since the war, historians, journalists, and the public have engaged in heated debates about whether the Pope knew about the mass murder of Jews, and if so, why he took no visible action. Vatican archives, partially opened only in 2020, revealed that the Pope knew far more than he ever publicly acknowledged. Since 1942, Pius XIII had received various reports of the persecution of Jews in occupied Europe. The sources were diverse: Catholic priests and bishops serving in occupied Poland, nuncios, papal ambassadors in various countries, Catholic organizations and aid groups, and even Jews who appealed to the Vatican for assistance. Archival documents show that in 1942, the Pope received detailed reports of the systematic murder of Jews in death camps. One of the most significant reports received by the Pope came from the papal nuncio to Slovakia, Giuseppe Burio. In 1942, Burio sent a report to the Vatican containing information on the deportation of Slovak Jews to Poland for extinction. The report was clear. Jews were not being sent to work. They were being sent to their deaths. This report was transmitted directly to Pius V, who instructed his deputy, Cardinal Domenico Tardi, to review it. However, no public statement was issued. In 1943, the papal nuncio to Turkey, Angelo Ronchi, later Pope John XXIII, sent a report to the Vatican on the deportation of Jews from various occupied territories. Ronchi was clear: people were being deported to death camps where they were murdered. This report also reached Pius X. Again, there was no public response. Why did the Pope remain silent? Historians offer several explanations, some of which are attempts at justification, others accusations. One of the main explanations is that the Vatican was concerned about its neutrality in the war. The Vatican was technically an independent state, located within Rome, which was controlled by Nazi Italy until 1943, and then by the German occupation after 1943. If the Pope made a strong public statement against the Nazis, the Vatican risked losing its neutrality and could be occupied by the Germans. This explanation, however, does not hold water. The Pope could have issued a strong condemnation without having to send in troops. Condemning a crime is not an act of war. Another explanation concerns the historical anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church. For centuries, the Catholic Church preached against Jews, blaming them for the death of Jesus. Although the Church's official stance softened by the 20th century, underground currents of anti-Semitism persisted within the Vatican hierarchy. Some archival documents discovered years later reveal that high-ranking Vatican officials, including some of Pius XII's advisors, expressed anti-Semitic views. This may have influenced the Pope's resolve to defend the Jewish population. The most likely explanation, however, is simpler and more tragic. Pius X was a bureaucrat, not a spiritual leader in a time of crisis. As historian Susan Zucott would later write, Pius X was more concerned with organizational matters than with moral ones. He was a man who preferred private conversations to public pronouncements, diplomacy to open condemnation. The Pope took several private actions. He instructed Catholic organizations and priests to assist Jews wherever possible. Some Catholic organizations did indeed assist Jews, hiding them in monasteries and other religious institutions. However, these actions, while noble, were minor compared to the scale of the disaster. They were also not publicly acknowledged by the Pope, meaning they could not inspire other Catholics to take similar actions. In 1943, as the German occupation of Rome worsened and the Germans began deporting German Jews from Rome, the Pope seemed to have an opportunity to speak out. However, Pius XIV chose to remain silent. As Cardinal Octavian, who advised the Pope at the time, would later write, "The Pope thought that a public condemnation could lead to worse treatment of Jews by the Nazis. This was the logic that later allowed many to justify the Pope's silence. But this logic was ethically dubious. There was no evidence that a public condemnation would have led to worse treatment. In fact, historian Daniel Goldhagen has suggested that a public condemnation by the Pope could have saved thousands of lives by inspiring Catholics to resist and defend Jews." After the war, Pius XV defended his position, claiming that his silence was a form of diplomacy aimed at minimizing harm. However, there was no evidence that his silence achieved this goal. On the contrary, his silence was interpreted by the Nazis as tacit approval, or at least a lack of objection, from the most moral authority in European Catholicism. In 1944, when death camp uprisings and escapes allowed more information about the Holocaust to come to light, Pius X relaxed his caution somewhat. He issued instructions to Catholic organizations to assist Jewish refugees, and he wrote the papal encyclical Mystici Corporis Christi, which, although it didn't explicitly mention Jews, contained attacks against racism. But these actions were belated and insufficient. By 1944, 4 million Jews had already been killed. No concrete action was taken to save the remaining lives. Archival documents opened in 2020 revealed that Pius X knew much more than he admitted. Surviving correspondence shows that the Pope received regular reports about the gas chambers, the number of people killed, and the methods of murder. He knew, and he chose silence. As historian John Cornish would later write, the Pope's silence was not the result of ignorance, but the result of choice. He chose neutrality at a time when neutrality meant complicity. One of the most treacherous aspects of the Allied silence was the role the Western press played in disseminating, or more accurately, suppressing, information about the Holocaust. In today's world, it's hard to imagine that information could be known to newspapers but never appear in the headlines. Yet, in 1942-1944, that's exactly what happened. Newspapers, even those that received information about mass murder, preferred to publish it on the back pages, if at all, or not at all. The New York Times, the most prestigious newspaper in the United States and one of the most influential in the world, is a prime example of this silence. The newspaper had correspondents in Switzerland, Sweden, and other neutral countries who received information about the Holocaust. The Times also received information from Jewish organizations desperately trying to tell the world about what was happening in Europe. However, the newspaper chose not to make this its main story. On August 30th, 1942, 3 weeks after Gerhard Riegner sent his famous telegram, the New York Times published a short article, about 200 words, on page 7, titled "Poles Told to Run or Die." Based on information from a Swiss news agency and the World Jewish Congress, the article contained the first mention in the American press of the Nazis' plan to exterminate all of Europe's Jews. However, The article was placed at the bottom of the page, alongside advertisements and other minor news. There was no editorial, no commentary, no attempt was made to elaborate or expand on the story. It was an example of what historian Naomi Cohen would later call the death of distraction. As she wrote, even when the news was published, it was buried among thousands of other news stories, so most readers missed it. In the following months and years, the New York Times published several more articles about the persecution of Jews, but the pattern remained consistent. The articles were short, placed on back pages, and rarely carried headlines that accurately reflected their content. For example, on July 25, 1944, the Times published an article titled "Death Camp Reports" that reported that more than 1 million Jews were murdered at Auschwitz. However, the article was placed on page 7, beneath articles about the war in the Pacific and the European campaign. Again, there was no editorial comment, no attempt to clarify the scale of the crime. After the war, the New York Times editor Arthur Hayes Sulzberger defended this policy, arguing that the newspaper did not want to be an instrument of Jewish propaganda and that it was trying to remain impartial. However, this impartiality was in fact a mistake. As historian David Lipsky would later write, impartiality in the face of crime is not a virtue. It is a form of false consensus. Other newspapers followed a similar policy. The Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and most other major U.S. newspapers published information about the Holocaust, if they published it at all, on the back pages. The British press followed a similar approach. The Times of London, The Guardian, and other prestigious newspapers reported on the massacres, but never made it their main news. Why? Historians have offered several explanations. One is that newspaper editors themselves were skeptical of the information. The idea of a modern industrial state devoting resources to the industrial murder of civilians seemed incredible. As historian Alan Mintz would later write, editors didn't believe such a thing was possible. It was beyond their experience and imagination. However, this explanation, while plausible, doesn't fully explain the silence. If the editors were skeptical, they should have investigated further and published their findings. Another explanation centers on anti-Semitism within newspaper editorial boards. Many editors of the time shared common anti-Semitic prejudices. They may have been reluctant to give Jews unnecessary attention, fearing it could fuel anti-Semitism. Paradoxically, keeping silent about the persecution of Jews was supposed to help reduce anti-Semitism. This paradox, similar to the one that shaped the stance of the State Department and the Foreign Office, reveals how deeply anti-Semitism was woven into the institutions of the time. The third explanation concerns editorial priorities. The editors were preoccupied with the war, military operations, politics, and economics. The fate of Jews in European death camps seemed less important to them than the progress of the war. As historian Robin Chapman would later write, the editors were men of their time. They did not see genocide as a priority. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same. Information about the Holocaust received by newspapers did not reach the general public in a way that would mobilize them to action. The New York Times would later win a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the war, but that coverage failed to adequately address the century's greatest crime. As media critics later wrote, the Times refused to be a voice for the voiceless, it chose silence. After the war, when the truth about the Holocaust came to light, many newspapers and editors were forced to reassess their role. Some apologized, others defended themselves. But the damage had already been done. The press's silence from 1942 to 1944 was one of the factors that allowed the Holocaust to continue with virtually no outside interference. As media critic Norman Solomon would later write, the press had power. It chose not to use it. In 1944, as the Holocaust reached its climax, two young Slovak Jews, Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler, Escape from Auschwitz. Their escape and subsequent report of what they witnessed in the camp constituted one of the most detailed and reliable accounts of the Holocaust obtained by the Allies before the camp's liberation. However, the reaction of the Allied governments to their testimony was disappointingly mild, another example of how official knowledge failed to lead to action. Verba and Wetzler escaped from Auschwitz on April 7, 1944, and reached Slovakia, where they contacted the local Jewish council. There, they told their story to representatives of Jewish organizations. Their testimonies were recorded and compiled into a report later known as the Auschwitz Protocol or the Verba-Wetzler Report, one of the most important Holocaust documents ever created. The Verba-Wetzler Report contained astonishing detail: a geographical description of the camp, including the precise locations of the gas chambers, information on the killing methods, including the use of Zyklon B, detailed statistics on the number of people killed. They estimated that about 1.7 million people were killed at Auschwitz alone, although this number was later found to be close to reality. A description of the crematoria and the methods of disposing of the bodies. Information on selection, the process of choosing who would be killed immediately and who would be used as labor, and a detailed description of the system of terror and control within the camp. The report was passed on to Jewish organizations in Switzerland, who urgently attempted to pass it on to the Allies. By May 1944, the report had reached the British and American governments through various channels. The Verba-Wetzler Report, as we now know it, was passed on to British intelligence, the U.S. State Department, and other government agencies. It was the most detailed and authoritative account of the Holocaust received by the Allies before the end of the war. What was the result? Almost nothing. British intelligence carefully examined the report and concluded that the information was generally reliable. However, as in previous cases, the government chose inaction. Churchill received a summary of the report but took no action. The Ministry of Defense again rejected proposals to bomb Auschwitz or the railway lines leading to the camp. The reason remained the same: diverting resources from the main target. Something similar happened in the United States. The State Department forwarded the report to President Roosevelt. Roosevelt apparently read the summary, but made no decisions based on it. The Army Department continued to reject proposals for a targeted bombing of the death camp or its infrastructure. What the general public didn't know, however, was that American bombers were already flying over Auschwitz. In August 1944, American B-17s bombed the chemical factories at Auschwitz III, Monowitz, located less than 10 kilometers from the main death camp. The bombers had precise coordinates. They were able to reach the gas chambers, and they had information about what would happen to the deported Jews. But they were ordered to bomb only the factories, leaving the death camp itself alone. The official explanation was the same. Bombing the camp was logistically impossible and politically undesirable. Verba and Wetzler, who risked their lives to escape and pass on information, were deeply disillusioned. After the war, Verba repeatedly expressed his bitterness in interviews that his testimony, which could have saved lives, was ignored. As he later said in an interview, "We fled to save people. We thought that if the world knew what was happening in Auschwitz, something would change. But the world knew, and nothing changed." Declassified documents discovered years later confirmed what historians had suspected. The Verba-Wetzler report was obtained not only by government agencies, but also by military strategists. The U.S. Army knew the exact locations of the gas chambers. They knew they could bomb the camp. They knew it would save thousands of lives. But the political will to do so was lacking. By August 1944, when the Verba-Wetzler report was fully disseminated, approximately 5 million Jews had already been killed. Fewer than 1 million survived. The bombing of Auschwitz in August 1944, for all its symbolic significance, would not have saved most of them. But it could have saved hundreds of thousands of those deported in the following months of the war. The Verba-Wetzler report, which had so little impact on Allied actions during the war, would later become one of the most important historical documents on the Holocaust. It would be widely used by historians and used at the Nuremberg trials as evidence of crimes against humanity. But during the war, when it mattered most, this evidence was simply ignored. May 1945. The war in Europe has ended. Allied forces liberate the last concentration and death camps. American and British soldiers entering Auschwitz, Dachau, and Buchenwald encounter scenes that upend their understanding of war and human nature. Stacked skeletons, crematoria, gas chambers, children's shoes, piles of hair, all provide visual evidence of the horror that continued for years while the world chose to remain silent. When the camps were liberated, the Western public, confronted for the first time with photographs and newsreels from the liberated camps, was shocked. Many people who had read newspaper articles but ignored them were now forced to acknowledge that the genocide was real and widespread. Hollywood newsreels, shown in movie theaters before feature films, showed the liberated camps. These images, so horrific that some viewers vomited in the theaters, finally forced American and European audiences to confront the truth. But when people asked why nothing had been done sooner, political leaders responded, "We didn't know." This became their primary line of defense. Churchill, Roosevelt, already dead by this time, and other political figures insisted they didn't realize the scale of the Holocaust until the end of the war. This was an outright lie. Documents later revealed show they knew, from 1942, in detail. But the lie was essential for their political reputations. In the immediate post-war years, information about the Allies' knowledge of the Holocaust remained largely hidden. Many documents were classified. Those involved in the decisions not to rescue victims remained silent. Memos, and diaries were either destroyed or safely hidden in archives. Gradually, however, through the work of historians and journalists, the truth began to emerge. In the 1950s and 1960s, the first comprehensive historical works on the Holocaust were published, written by Lucy Dawidowicz, Raoul Hilberg, and others. These historians, having studied the available documents, began to reconstruct a picture of what the Allies knew and when they knew it. The picture was disheartening and damning. In the 1960s, survivor memoirs emerged. Testimonies from people who had endured the hellish ordeal and survived became available. These recollections, many of which included details about what the Allies knew but failed to act on, added another layer to the growing understanding of what happened. Israel, founded in 1948, became a center for preserving and disseminating the memory of the Holocaust. In 1961, the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi official responsible for organizing the deportation of Jews, took place in Israel. Eichmann's trial marked a significant milestone in the world's understanding of the scale of the Holocaust. During the trial, evidence was presented that the Allies knew about the deportations and mass murders, but took no action. Witnesses, including Rudolf Verba, testified that they had attempted to pass information to the Allies, but were ignored. In the 1970s and 1980s, with the further declassification of documents, the full extent of Allied knowledge and inaction became clear. Books such as What Did America Know and When Did It Know It? And The Struggle for the American Soul began to reveal the truth, that the US and British governments knew about the Holocaust, but chose not to rescue the victims. The British government declassified its Holocaust-related archives later than the American one. When they were finally opened, they revealed that British officials had been informed of gas chambers as early as 1942. The Foreign Office had detailed reports on killing methods at Auschwitz and other camps. British intelligence intercepted German communications containing information on the number of people killed. And yet, nothing was done. The declassification of U.S. government documents revealed a similar picture. The State Department knew, the Army knew, the White House knew, and the choice not to act was made deliberately, based on political calculations, not ignorance. As historian Bruce Commager later wrote, it was a choice. a tragic and immoral choice, but a choice nonetheless. The Vatican also began opening its archives, especially after the Second Vatican Council, 1962-1965, at which the Catholic Church officially disassociated itself from historical anti-Semitism. Vatican archival documents revealed that Pius X knew about the mass murder of Jews in detail, but chose diplomacy and silence over public condemnation. This sparked a long debate about the Pope's moral responsibility. By the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, it became clear there was no ignorance. There was awareness and a choice to inaction. The Allies, with information, resources, and the ability to save people, chose not to save them. They chose silence, and that silence killed millions. After the war, when the truth about the Holocaust was fully revealed, and when the evidence of the Allies' knowledge became irrefutable, a new term emerged in Holocaust historiography: the medal of silence. It was a metaphor coined by historians to describe what happened. It wasn't a literal medal awarded for valor. It was a symbolic medal that historians bestowed upon those who knew about the greatest crime of the 20th century, but chose to remain silent. The Medal of Silence was awarded to Churchill and Roosevelt, who knew but remained silent. It was awarded to Breckinridge Long and other State Department officials who closed America to Jewish refugees. It was awarded to the editors of the New York Times and other newspapers who knew but did not make the story headline news. It was awarded to Pope Pius X, who received reports of the gas chambers but chose to remain silent. It was awarded to the British and American strategists who could have bombed the camps but chose not to. And more broadly, it was awarded to the world that knew but chose not to see. What's most tragic is that the Silence Medal was something each participant in the victory felt they were protecting themselves with. Churchill and Roosevelt believed silence protected their war strategy. State Department officials believed silence protected against anti-Semitism. Newspapers believed silence protected against the reputation of political bias. The Pope believed silence protected the Vatican's neutrality. The military believed silence protected a focus on victory, but silence protected nothing. It only killed more. After the war, at the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were tried for crimes against humanity, a crucial question arose. If the world knew about the crimes, why didn't it stop them? The answer was simple and horrifying: because the world didn't want to stop them. Because it was easier to remain silent. Because other goals seemed more important. Because anti-Semitism was deep enough to confuse priorities. A historian at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Research Center, devoted significant resources to studying the question of what the Allies knew and why they failed to act. The researchers' conclusions were relentless. The Allies knew. They had the ability to save people. They chose not to. A Medal of Silence had been awarded to history, and history seemed to recognize this award. In the 21st century, with the availability of information online and the continued openness of archives, new generations of historians have been able to deepen our understanding of that period. They have uncovered memos that reveal the precise content of discussions among political leaders. They have found the diaries of journalists who expressed regret that they did not do more to publicize information about the Holocaust. They have found letters from refugees who begged their governments for help, and from family members who wanted to save their loved ones but were turned away by bureaucracy and prejudice. All these sources paint an inexorable picture. The greatest evil of the 20th century persisted not because of ignorance, but because those who knew chose to remain silent and do nothing. Sometimes in life, and especially in history, silence speaks louder than words. In the case of the Holocaust, silence was so loud that it claimed the lives of millions. The lesson of the Medal for Silence remains relevant today. When the world confronts genocide or crimes against humanity anywhere, historians and moralists recall the Holocaust. They remember that silence is a choice. that inaction is a decision, that I didn't know often means I chose not to know, and that history judges not only the perpetrators, but also those who stood by and allowed the crimes to happen. Gerhard Riegner, who in 1942 transmitted the first information about the Nazi plan to exterminate all the Jews of Europe, survived the war and lived until 1978. In his memoirs, he wrote of his disappointment that his telegram, which could have saved millions of lives if it had been made public and if it had inspired action, was delayed, held up, and ultimately ignored. Rudolf Verba, who risked his life to escape from Auschwitz and transmit information about the death camp, also expressed bitterness in his memoirs. He wrote that he was a messenger of death who came with a message of death, but no one wanted to listen. Sometimes victory comes not because of a plan, but in spite of it. The Holocaust was stopped not because the Allies saved the victims, but because they ultimately won the war and liberated the remaining camps. But how many lives could have been saved if those who knew had chosen to act sooner? How much suffering could have been avoided? How many future lives and happiness were lost when millions were murdered? The medal of silence is a reminder that the greatest crimes often occur not because they are unseen, but because those who do choose to turn a blind eye. Silence can be a crime. Indifference can be complicity. And sometimes, simply speaking the truth, simply refusing to remain silent, can save millions of lives. But at the cost of the Holocaust, this lesson was learned too late.